You're listening to quiet thoughts for grown-ups, nothing to focus on, nothing to fix. Just some quiet thoughts in the background. You know, at some point in life, comfort stops being optional. It stops being nice to have and becomes non-negotiable. Shoes that pinch, gone. Jackets that restrict movement, gone. Socks that make your toes question their existence, gone. You start picking things, not because they look good, but because they feel right. And here's the fun part, you start defending it. You walk into a shop with a new jacket in your hand, and someone gives you that look, the one that silently says, "That's not very stylish." And you just smile because in your head it's perfect. Perfect for bending, stretching, sitting, reaching for tea without complaining. Perfect for living style. That's negotiable comfort. That's sacred. You even find yourself giving little speeches to friends, sometimes out loud, sometimes just in your own head. I'd rather enjoy my evening than strangle myself in skinny jeans. And strangely, people stop arguing after a while. They see the calm in your movements, the lack of wincing, the quiet satisfaction. You've won without trying, simply by choosing to exist comfortably. And the best part, it's contagious. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, your friends start noticing. They begin to respect the chair you pick, the shoes you wear, the scarf you wrap around your neck. Comfort has a kind of understated authority. So next time someone questions your choices, the relaxed shoes, the soft jumper, the perfectly sagging sofa spot, just smile and let them watch. Because you're not just choosing comfort, you're mastering it. And frankly, that's a victory worth celebrating quietly every single day. It's funny how memory works as you get older. Names gone, completely gone. You'll meet someone new, shake their hand, and somewhere inside your brain, the words have evaporated, but the utterly irrelevant details. Oh, those are crystal clear, like the exact shade of the curtains in their living room 10 years ago. Or the fact that they once wore mismatched socks to a Christmas party. You don't need that information, it serves no purpose, but it's somehow impossible to forget. And the more you try to remember a name, the more it slips away. So there you are, smiling politely, calling someone mate or friend, all the while rehearsing the tiny unnecessary facts that your brain has filed away forever. You'll remember the story of their cat, the brand of coffee they bought once, or the exact time they tripped on the pavement. But their name, poof, vanished. The strange part is, it almost becomes a superpower. You can recall all these odd, seemingly useless details that make conversations feel familiar and personal. You can tell someone, "I remember the scarf you wore on that snowy day in 2012, and they're stunned even if you can't remember their name. And you realize maybe names aren't that important anyway. What matters is the tiny mosaic of moments, the quirks and little stories, the bits that stick and linger. Those are the things that make someone memorable, and somehow that feels more satisfying than remembering a simple name ever could. Do you catch yourself overthinking the simplest things? You start out with something tiny, choosing a sandwich, replying to a message, deciding whether to leave the house now or in 5 minutes. And before you know it, you're deep in analysis, weighing options that don't really exist. You stand there genuinely considering all the possible outcomes, as if the future depends on whether you choose white bread or brown. And at some point, you catch yourself. There's a brief pause, a moment of clarity, and you realize you've spent far longer thinking about the thing than it would have taken to just do it. That's usually when the laugh arrives. Not a big laugh, more of a quiet, private one. The kind that says, "Ah, I see what's happening here." You're not annoyed, you're not frustrated, you're just mildly amused by your own mind, wandering off with confidence and absolutely no sense of proportion. And the nice thing is, once you notice it, the spell breaks, the decision becomes easy again. You choose something, anything, and the world continues exactly as it did before. Nothing collapses, no one complains, the moment passes. So when you catch yourself overthinking the small stuff, it's worth smiling at it, because that little laugh isn't giving up, it's understanding. And sometimes that's all you really need to move on, quietly and comfortably, with the day unfolding just fine. There's a moment in life when bedtime quietly shifts. No announcement, no discussion, no dramatic decision. It just happens earlier than you expect. One day you're someone who stays up late because you can, and the next you're glancing at the clock and thinking, well, that's probably enough for today. What's interesting is how reasonable it feels. There's no rebellion, no sense of missing out. You're not tired in a dramatic way. You're just done. The day has had its say, and you've listened politely. Even the idea of staying up feels like unnecessary effort, like insisting on dessert when you're already perfectly content. You start planning evenings differently without quite realizing it. Films get paused halfway through with the calm confidence that they'll still exist tomorrow. Books fall gently onto the bedside table instead of being finished. There's a quiet satisfaction in knowing you don't have to push yourself anymore. You've earned the right to stop. And the best part is the morning, waking up earlier, doesn't feel like punishment. It feels spacious. There's time for tea, for sitting quietly, for easing into the day without rushing. You realize that the earlier bedtime wasn't about getting older. It was about choosing peace over resistance. So when you find yourself heading to bed earlier than you once would have, don't fight it. You're not missing anything. You're simply listening to a quieter rhythm. Now, and honestly, it's a rather pleasant one to fall asleep to. There's a quiet moment that sneaks up on you at some point in life, when you realize you've picked something up again that you once put down for good, a hobby, something you were absolutely certain you'd outgrown, not abandoned temporarily, finished with. Maybe it's an old book or a bit of music you haven't listened to in years. Maybe it's something you haven't even thought about for decades. You don't make a big decision about it. You just find yourself doing it, almost by accident, and wondering why you ever stopped. What's different now is the pace. You're not trying to be good at it. You're not trying to turn it into anything. You're just enjoying the shape of it, the familiarity, the feeling of your hands remembering what to do before your head catches up. It's strangely comforting, like meeting an old friend and realizing you don't need to impress each other anymore. And there's no urgency, no sense that it has to lead anywhere. If anything, the joy comes from knowing it doesn't. You can put it down again tomorrow and pick it up next month, and it'll still be there, patient, unbothered. It's a small reminder that not everything in life needs to move forward. Some things are happy to wait for you to come back, quietly, when you're ready. And when they do, they fit into your life in a way they never quite did the first time around. Weekends used to arrive with a bit of drama. There was anticipation, plans, a sense that something had to happen. At some point, though, the rhythm changes quietly, without announcement, and weekends become something else entirely. You still notice Friday, of course, but instead of excitement, it's more like relief, a gentle exhale. The weekend isn't a blank canvas anymore. It's a softer version of the week, familiar, predictable, comforting. Saturday mornings arrive earlier than they used to, often without effort. You wake up naturally, sometimes before the alarm, and there's a brief moment of confusion before you remember there's nowhere you have to be, and somehow that's better than sleeping in ever was. You find yourself doing small, unremarkable things, a bit of tidying, a slow cup of tea, maybe a walk that has no real destination. There's no rush to make the most of it. The enjoyment is quieter now, tucked into the spaces between tasks, and then Sunday comes along carrying that familiar feeling that used to mean dread. But even that softens with time. It becomes more about easing into the week than resisting it. You prepare gently, you put things in their place, you wind down without fighting the clock. Nothing about weekends is worse. They're just different, less loud, less ambitious, more forgiving. And somewhere along the way, you realize this new rhythm suits you perfectly. It's not about escaping life anymore. It's about settling comfortably into it. There's a particular kind of joy that sneaks up on you as you get older, and it's not the big, dramatic kind, it's the joy of small improvements, the kind no one else notices, and honestly, you don't really want them to. It's things like finally fixing a cupboard door that's been slightly off for years. Nothing dramatic changes. The kitchen looks the same, but every time you open it, there's a tiny moment of satisfaction, a quiet sense that the world is, at least in this one small corner, behaving itself, or replacing something that was technically working, but only just a kettle that took too long, a light bulb that flickered, a drawer that needed a very specific jiggle. Once it's sorted, life doesn't get better in a noticeable way. It just gets smoother, and that smoothness starts to matter. What's strange is how invisible these improvements are to everyone else. You don't announce them, you don't point them out, you simply enjoy them privately, like a small secret between you and your environment, a mutual understanding that things are now slightly improved. And the more of these tiny fixes you make, the calmer everything feels, not because anything big has changed, but because fewer things are quietly irritating you, fewer sighs, fewer eye rolls, fewer moments of mild resistance. So when you catch yourself feeling oddly pleased about a quieter hinge or a better fitting lid, don't dismiss it. That's not boredom, that's wisdom. It's the quiet joy of small, everyday improvements, the kind that make life feel just a little bit more settled, one unnoticed upgrade at a time. So there's this thing that happens when you get a bit older. Maybe it's subtle at first, or maybe you don't notice until one day it hits you. Every room you go into suddenly seems to have a chair that's yours. Not literally yours, of course, but somehow it's the one you gravitate to. You walk into the living room, and there it is. The cushions are slightly too soft, the angle of the backrest just right. You settle in, and immediately everything else feels wrong. The sofa too wide, the other chair too upright. Somehow this chair gets you, then the kitchen, same thing. There's a seat that calls to you, maybe by the window or near the radiator. You don't choose it consciously, you just end up there, day after day. It's like the universe quietly assigned it to you, and you're too polite to say no. The funny part is, no one else notices. Friends sit down, shrug, shuffle uncomfortably, but the chair remains your chair. You try sitting somewhere else just for a change. It's okay for a minute or two, but eventually you're back in the chair that fits your body, your rhythm, your slightly creaky knees. And the real kicker, you start noticing it everywhere. When you visit your parents, the same chair phenomenon exists. Hotels, pubs, even friends' houses. There's always one chair that somehow makes sense. It's not a big deal, but somehow it's comforting, familiar, like a little anchor in a world that's otherwise constantly changing. So next time you settle into a chair and sigh without really thinking about it, know this: you've officially discovered one of middle age's most understated joys. Your chair has chosen you, and really, that's not too bad at all. There's a very particular kind of satisfaction that arrives quietly as you get older, and it's the moment you realise you know exactly which route through town avoids chaos. Not the fastest route on paper, not the one the sat-nav insists on, but the one that simply works. You don't announce it. You don't feel the need to explain it. You just turn left where everyone else goes right, ease down a side street, glide past a row of parked cars, and suddenly the world feels calmer. The lights are kinder here. The traffic moves differently. You've slipped through the gaps without anyone noticing. What's funny is how instinctive it becomes. You don't really think about it anymore. Your hands just turn the wheel, your feet adjust automatically, and somewhere deep down there's a quiet confidence that says, this way. You've learned this route over years through roadworks, school runs, temporary closures, and one disastrous diversion you still haven't forgiven, and every now and then you catch a glimpse of the main road you've avoided. Cars stacked nose to tail, indicators flashing in frustration, people gripping their steering wheels like it's a competitive sport. You feel a small, private triumph, not smugness, just relief, a gentle sense that you've made the right choice. It's not about speed anymore. It's about flow, about choosing the path that keeps your shoulders relaxed and your breathing steady, knowing where the bottlenecks are and quietly stepping around them. And maybe that's one of the underrated perks of getting older. Not knowing everything, but knowing enough to move through the world with a little less friction, one calm side street at a time. There's a quiet satisfaction that comes from looking up at the sky and knowing what's about to happen. Not checking an app, not asking anyone, just glancing upward and thinking, yes, that's rain later. It's not dramatic knowledge. You're not forecasting storms or issuing warnings. It's more subtle than that. The colour of the clouds, the way the light looks a bit tired, the stillness that creeps in before the air changes its mind. You don't announce it loudly, you just mention it casually, almost as an aside, and when it happens, that's the moment. The rain arrives exactly when you expected it to, or the sun holds on just long enough to prove you right. You don't celebrate, you don't even smile much, but inside there's a small contained thrill. A quiet yes. What makes it better is that no one really notices. They'll say something like, oh, it's turned, hasn't it? And you'll nod as if this was all inevitable. You don't mention that you knew half an hour ago purely from the way the sky looked. That knowledge is for you. At some point, this becomes part of your identity. You start trusting the sky more than the forecast. You'll glance outside before leaving the house. Adjust a coat, choose shoes accordingly. It feels sensible, earned, almost wise. And when you do get it wrong, which does happen, you don't mind too much, because the act of looking up, of paying attention, feels grounding in itself. You're part of the day, not just reacting to it. So next time you step outside, pause for a moment, look at the clouds, the light, the way the air feels. If you get it right, enjoy the quiet satisfaction, and if you don't, well, at least you notice the sky, and that, somehow, feels like a win too. You've been listening to quiet thoughts for grown-ups. And now, history explained with the confidence of a man holding the wrong map. This is Balmy Biographies. Alfred the Great was born in 849 AD, a time when England was less a country and more a collection of damp arguments connected by mud. He was the youngest son of King Ethelwulf of Wessex, whose name looks like someone dropped a Scrabble set and decided to keep the result. Nobody expected Alfred to be king, mainly because he had several older brothers who were doing a perfectly good job of getting killed by Vikings. The Vikings, at this point in history, were essentially Scandinavia's way of saying hello with axes. By the time Alfred reached adulthood, most of England had been helpfully reorganised into something called the Danelaw, which was Danish for our stuff now. Alfred was described as clever, pious, and not very keen on being stabbed, which already put him ahead of many rulers. He spent part of his youth travelling to Rome, where he learned important continental skills such as reading, praying, and realising that England could really do with some indoor plumbing. In 871 he became King of Wessex after his brother Ethelred died, possibly from wounds, possibly from trying to pronounce his own name too quickly. Alfred immediately faced the problem that the Vikings were everywhere, including places that technically belonged to him, like outside and most directions. After several battles, Alfred was forced to hide in the Somerset marshes disguised as a normal person. This led to the famous incident where a peasant woman asked him to watch her cakes, and he let them burn, proving that even great leaders can be defeated by basic domestic multitasking. Historians still debate whether this story is true, but it feels emotionally accurate. Eventually Alfred reorganised his army, invented a system of fortified towns called burhs, and built a navy, which was revolutionary because until then England's main defence against sea invasion had been hoping the sea would behave. He defeated the Viking leader Guthrum, who agreed to be baptised, presumably after Alfred explained that Christianity came with fewer surprise axes. Alfred didn't just fight, he also believed in learning. He translated books into Old English, encouraged education, and started the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a sort of national diary that mainly recorded who had invaded this week. He wanted his people to be able to read, which was radical at a time when most kings considered literacy a suspicious foreign hobby. By the time he died in 899, Alfred had transformed Wessex from next on the Viking list into the foundation of what would eventually become England. He is the only English king officially called the Great, partly for his achievements, and partly because Alfred the reasonably competent didn't look as good on statues. Today Alfred is remembered as a warrior, a scholar, and the patron saint of burnt cakes. His life proved that with enough determination, organisation, and emergency marshes, even a small soggy kingdom can stand up to men in horned helmets, who, disappointingly, probably didn't even have horns. And that was Alfred, the great king, bookworm, cake wrecker, and the first Englishman to realise that national survival requires both swords and a decent library card. Charles Darwin was born in 1809, which was a time when people believed God had personally arranged every animal on Earth like ornaments on a very large mantelpiece. Young Charles was expected to become a doctor, but he quickly discovered he didn't enjoy the sight of blood, screaming patients, or doctors, which ruled out most of medicine. Instead, he went to study to be a vicar, mainly because it involved long walks, thinking about beetles, and not being shouted at by surgeons. Darwin was extremely fond of beetles. In fact, he once tried to carry so many beetles at once that one of them escaped into his mouth, which science later called the first peer-reviewed snack. His life changed when he was invited to sail on HMS Beagle, a ship named after a dog, even though it was technically a boat. The voyage was meant to last 2 years, but went on for 5, possibly because the captain kept stopping to ask for directions from turtles. Darwin visited the Galapagos Islands, where he noticed that the finches were all slightly different, like a collection of spoons that had attended different schools. This led him to wonder whether animals might change over time, instead of arriving fully assembled like Victorian furniture. He called this idea natural selection, which is basically nature saying, "I like that one, the rest can go in the loft." Darwin spent years thinking about his theory, partly because he wanted to be sure, and partly because he was terrified that Victorian society would react by fainting onto a chaise longue. He filled notebooks with careful observations such as pigeons, surprisingly complicated, and worms, doing more than we think emotionally. In 1859, he finally published On the Origin of Species, a book that politely suggested humans might be related to monkeys, which many humans took as a personal insult. Some people said the theory was dangerous, others said it was brilliant, and a few misheard it and thought Darwin had invented oranges. Despite the controversy, Darwin was a gentle, slightly anxious man who preferred gardening to arguments. He suffered from mysterious illnesses, possibly caused by stress, seasickness, or accidentally thinking too hard about barnacles. He studied those for 8 years, which is longer than most people spend studying their own children. Darwin died in 1882 and was buried in Westminster Abbey, proving that even the church eventually decided evolution was at least worth a good seat at the funerals. His ideas changed how we understand life, nature, and why some relatives are better adapted to Christmas dinner than others. Today he is remembered as the man who explained where we came from, why peacocks look so pleased with themselves, and how a perfectly respectable Victorian hobby like staring at pigeons can accidentally rewrite the entire story of existence. Florence Nightingale was born in 1820 in Florence, Italy, which is either a charming coincidence or the least imaginative piece of baby naming in history. Her wealthy British parents had been touring Europe at the time, presumably ticking off cathedrals and inventing the concept of the embarrassing holiday photo. As a young woman, Florence announced she wanted to be a nurse. This was shocking, because in Victorian England, nursing was considered slightly below professional pigeon and only marginally above haunted mop. Respectable ladies were supposed to faint delicately, not roll up their sleeves and deal with people who were actively leaking. Florence claimed she had received a calling from God, which her family interpreted as a phase, like watercolours. They tried to distract her with parties, eligible bachelors, and the exciting life of doing absolutely nothing in a large dress. Florence responded by reading medical textbooks and becoming increasingly terrifying. In 1854, the Crimean War broke out, and the British Army discovered that its medical system consisted mainly of optimism and a bucket. Wounded soldiers were being treated in hospitals so filthy that even the rats were writing letters of complaint. Florence was sent to sort it out, possibly because everyone else had suddenly remembered an urgent appointment elsewhere. She arrived at Scutari Hospital with a team of nurses and was horrified to discover conditions that made medieval plagues look like spa weekends. There were no clean bandages, no proper food, and the drains appeared to have been designed by someone who actively disliked pipes. Florence did what any reasonable person would do. She cleaned everything, organised supplies, shouted at generals, and invented modern nursing while running On approximately 3 hours of sleep and pure indignation, she became known as the Lady with the Lamp because she walked the wards at night, checking on patients, and also because the lady with the extremely strong opinions about ventilation didn't fit in the newspapers. She used statistics to prove that more soldiers were dying from disease than from being shot, which was awkward for the army, who had spent years assuming bullets were the main problem. Florence drew charts so persuasive that even Victorian men were forced to admit a woman might be right, an event some historians classify as a miracle. After the war, she returned to Britain a national hero and immediately began campaigning for healthcare reform. She wrote books, redesigned hospitals, and terrified politicians with numbers until they agreed to behave better. She also kept a pet owl called Athena, proving that even legends need someone to judge them silently from a perch. Florence Nightingale lived to the impressive age of 90, despite spending much of her life surrounded by things that were trying very hard to be contagious. She transformed nursing into a respected profession and established the idea that hospitals should be clean, which seems obvious now, but was then considered a radical lifestyle choice. Today she is remembered as the founder of modern nursing, the patron saint of disinfectant, and the first person to realise that saving lives sometimes requires a mop, a pie chart, and the ability to frighten powerful men using only sensible shoes. And that was Florence Nightingale, proof that one determined woman with a lamp can achieve more than an entire empire with a committee. Henry VIII was born in 1491, back when numbers were still quite low, and England was ruled by people with extremely confident eyebrows. He was the second son of Henry VII, which was confusing for everyone because it meant the royal family sounded like a sequel that hadn't decided what genre it was. As a young prince, Henry was handsome, sporty, and very fond of hitting things with sticks, which in those days counted as both education and personality. He wasn't actually supposed to be king at all. That job was meant for his older brother Arthur, but Arthur inconveniently died, possibly of illness, possibly of Tudor plot convenience syndrome, leaving Henry to inherit the throne, and slightly awkwardly, Arthur's wife Catherine of Aragon. This was considered normal at the time, in the same way that wearing tights and a codpiece was considered smart casual. Henry became king in 1509 and immediately set about doing kingly things like hunting deer, starting wars with France, and eating meals that required their own postcode. He was also very religious, right up until the Pope told him he couldn't divorce Catherine. At this point, Henry suddenly realised that perhaps the Pope wasn't in charge after all, and that maybe, just maybe, God had always intended Henry to be his own manager. This bold theological insight led to the English Reformation, in which Henry created the Church of England, mainly so he could marry Anne Boleyn without filling in forms in triplicate. Historians call this a profound moment of spiritual independence. Anne Boleyn called it Tuesday. Unfortunately, Anne failed to provide Henry with a son, which in Tudor times was considered a worse crime than actual crimes. Henry solved this problem in the traditional manner by having her head removed, an early example of workplace downsizing. He then married Jane Seymour, who did produce a son, Edward, before tragically dying, proving that being married to Henry was slightly less safe than living inside a volcano. Over the years, Henry collected wives in much the same way other men collect novelty mugs. Catherine of Aragon divorced, Anne Boleyn beheaded. Jane Seymour died, Anne of Cleves returned under warranty. Catherine Howard also beheaded, suggesting Henry hadn't read the instructions. And Catherine Parr survived, possibly by hiding behind furniture. As he grew older, Henry became larger, louder, and more convinced that everyone else was doing history wrong. A jousting accident left him with a bad leg, which meant he could no longer run about hitting things with sticks. So he took up the more relaxing hobbies of signing death warrants and redesigning religion. By the time he died in 1547, Henry had transformed England, closed the monasteries, and eaten roughly the entire wildlife population of the British Isles. He left the throne to his young son, Edward VI, along with a country that was richer, more Protestant, and extremely nervous. Today, Henry VIII is remembered as the king with 6 wives, a magnificent beard, and a personality best described as absolute Wi-Fi router that needs turning off and on again. His reign proved that one determined man can change the course of history, especially if he has a sharp sword, a flexible approach to marriage, and absolutely no ability to take no for an answer. Horatio Nelson was born in 1758 in Norfolk, a part of England famous for flat fields, enthusiastic seagulls, and producing people who later shout at the French. He was the 6th of 11 children, which in the 18th century was considered a small, manageable starter pack. Nelson went to sea at the age of 12, partly because he dreamed of adventure, and partly because in those days career guidance consisted of an uncle pointing at a boat and saying, "Get on that and try not to die." The Royal Navy was a floating mixture of heroism, scurvy, and men named things like Blenkinsop, who had strong opinions about knots. He quickly proved himself brave, clever, and slightly too fond of standing in places where cannonballs were likely to visit. Over the course of his career he lost an eye, an arm, and several perfectly good hats, though never his confidence. In portraits, he is usually shown looking heroic while subtly rearranging his remaining limbs like luggage. Nelson became famous during the Napoleonic Wars, when Britain and France were engaged in a long-running disagreement about who was allowed to be in charge of Europe, and also the sea and possibly the weather. Nelson's strategy was simple: sail directly at the enemy, do something unexpected, and hope the paperwork could be sorted out afterwards. His greatest victory came at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, where he defeated the combined French and Spanish fleets using a tactic historians describe as bold genius and sailors describe as absolutely terrifying. Before the battle he sent the signal, "England expects that every man will do his duty," which was the Georgian equivalent of posting, "You've got this," on social media, except with more cannons. Nelson was also famous for his complicated personal life. He had a passionate relationship with Emma Hamilton, which scandalized polite society and delighted everyone who secretly enjoyed a good bit of gossip about national heroes behaving like overexcited cockapoos. Sadly, Trafalgar was Nelson's final appearance. He was shot by a French sniper while standing on deck wearing enough medals to be visible from space. He died knowing he had won, which is generally considered the best way to exit a naval battle, and also most dinner parties. His body was brought back to England, preserved in a barrel of brandy, leading to the long-standing naval tradition of never fully trusting drinks that have been on a voyage. He was buried in St. Paul's Cathedral, and a very tall column was built in London, so pigeons would always have somewhere to consider the meaning of leadership. Today Nelson is remembered as Britain's greatest admiral, a tactical genius, and the man who proved you can misplace half your body and still have a very successful career. His life demonstrated that victory at sea depends on courage, imagination, and the ability to look dramatic while pointing at the horizon. And that was Horatio Nelson, sailor, strategist, enthusiastic owner of fewer arms than average, and the only man in history to become a national monument, largely by refusing to stand somewhere safer. Julius Caesar was born in 100 BC, which stands for before calendars were good. He arrived into a respectable Roman family, though not the sort of family that could casually buy a province for a birthday present. His full name was Gaius Julius Caesar, which sounds like three people arguing over who gets the bill. As a young man, Caesar was kidnapped by pirates, an experience that would shape his personality in the same way being microwaved shapes soup. Instead of panicking, he reportedly told the pirates they were asking too little ransom and promised to come back and crucify them later, which is the Roman equivalent of leaving a one-star review. He began his political career through the traditional Roman methods of making speeches, shaking hands, and borrowing alarming amounts of money. Roman elections were a bit like modern ones, except instead of kissing babies, you occasionally conquered a small country to prove you were serious about local issues. Caesar joined forces with Pompey and Crassus in what historians call the first triumvirate, and normal people call three blokes who definitely didn't trust each other. Together they ran Rome in the same way three cats might run a bakery, loudly and with unexpected violence. His greatest achievement was conquering Gaul, which is roughly modern France and therefore explains a lot. Caesar wrote a book about it called The Gallic Wars, in which he modestly described himself in the third person as if he were his own biggest fan. The book is considered a masterpiece of Latin literature and also of professional bragging. Eventually the Senate became worried that Caesar was getting too powerful, mostly because he was getting too powerful. When he crossed the Rubicon River with his army, it was an act so illegal that even modern politicians would have described it as not ideal. This sparked a civil war, which Caesar won by being better at civil wars than everyone else. He became dictator of Rome and introduced many reforms, including a new calendar that actually worked, roads that went to places on purpose, and the idea that maybe the Senate shouldn't stab people quite so often. He also started wearing a laurel wreath to hide his bald patch, proving that even in ancient times men would rather conquer continents than discuss hair loss. On the 15th of March 44 BC, Caesar went to the Senate House despite several warnings, including a note from his wife, and possibly the entire concept of common sense. There he was stabbed 23 times by a group of senators who believed in saving the Republic through enthusiastic knife-based teamwork. His last words were supposedly et tu, Brute, which means seriously, Brutus, you too, although some historians think he actually said something more like, well, this is a bit much. After his death, Rome plunged into more civil wars, eventually ending up with emperors, which was exactly what the senators had been trying to avoid, in the same way that setting fire to your house is an unusual method of preventing candles. Today, Julius Caesar is remembered as a brilliant general, a cunning politician, and the only man in history whose salad is more famous than his actual personality. His life proved that in Rome you could achieve anything, provided you avoided meetings with friends who were overly interested in cutlery. William Shakespeare was born in the olden days when England was still in black and white, and people spoke entirely in quotes they didn't yet know were famous. Historians agree he arrived in Stratford upon Avon in 1564, although some believe he may have been delivered by a midwife who later forgot to write it down because she was busy inventing the concept of Tuesday. As a child, William attended grammar school, where he learned Latin, Greek, and how to look thoughtful while not understanding Latin or Greek. This education was extremely useful because it meant that when he later made up words like bump and eyeball, he could pretend they were classical. At 18, he married Anne Hathaway, who was not the American actress because films hadn't been invented and neither had America in the modern sense. They had 3 children, proving that even the greatest writer in history was still expected to take the bins out, although the bins were probably just a hopeful hole. Soon after, Shakespeare went to London to become an actor. London at the time was a bustling cultural centre full of theatres, plague, and people throwing vegetables at anyone who looked confident. He joined a company called the Lord Chamberlain's Men, which sounds like a group of superheroes who fight crime using waistcoats. Shakespeare wrote at least 37 plays, or possibly 38, depending on whether you count Two Gentlemen of Verona as one play or Two Gentlemen, having a very long argument. His works include tragedies, comedies, and history plays, which are tragedies that have homework afterwards. He invented many phrases still used today, such as break the ice, wild goose chase, and what the hell is going on in Act 4? Nobody knows exactly how he wrote so much. Some experts think he worked very hard, while others believe the plays were written by someone else called Shakespeare, who looked identical and lived in the same house, which would have been an incredible coincidence. He performed at the Globe Theatre, a wooden building shaped like a donut that occasionally caught fire to keep the audience alert. There were no special effects, so when a character needed to disappear, they simply walked off while everyone pretended not to notice, which is still how politics works. In 1616 Shakespeare died, possibly from a fever, possibly from too much excitement about inventing the knock-knock joke. He left his second best bed to his wife, which sounds rude but was actually the Elizabethan version of a romantic gesture, like buying someone a toaster with only one slot. Today he is regarded as the greatest writer in the English language, even though he spelled his own name at least 6 different ways, suggesting he was either very creative or owned a particularly chaotic pen. His legacy lives on in theatres, classrooms, and in the fact that whenever anything dramatic happens, someone will inevitably say, "This is just like Shakespeare," even if it's only a cat falling off a chair. And that, more or less, was William Shakespeare, playwright, actor, husband of the correct Anne Hathaway, and the first person to realise that if you put the word thou in front of anything, it sounds important.